step up the wrong place. On behalf of the Labor Party.
The member is calling, is he?
I do.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
And I now thank you, Mr Speaker, for allowing me to take a call on the third reading of the Taxation, Annual Rates, Employee Allowances and Remedial Matters Bill, which the Labor Party is supporting. I wondered what I was going to add to the earlier contributions that I'd made in this debate until the Minister spoke. And the Minister, and I wrote his comment down, he said the purpose of this legislation, the purpose is to make sure that everyone pays their fair share of tax. Well, wouldn't that be great if that was the effect of this bill? Wouldn't that be great if that was the effect of this bill? Because this is the Minister who, in the chair last night, when asked the question that he wouldn't answer at Select Committee about how many people pay tax on their capital gains for investment property, well, actually the bill, Mr Goldsmith, you're from Epsom. I'm surprised that you don't know that most of your members don't want to pay capital gains because they disproportionately earn their income as capital gains. The Minister said that this bill about annual rates of income tax, therefore affecting tax on what is taxable income, the question is quite properly raised is what sort of economic income is caught by the regime and what isn't. And so Mr Goldsmith actually, Mr Goldsmith was at the Select Committee, the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee a couple of weeks ago when the question or the assertion was made initially by the Minister of Revenue, Todd McClay, that we already have a capital gains tax in New Zealand on investment property. And it is true that if you buy with the purpose of resale or you're a trader, then your house becomes your stock and trade, just as if it would be if you were buying and selling shoes. It's treated in the same way as stock and trade, and you you account for income tax on your profits on your cost of sales, profits over and above your cost of sales, and therefore you do pay income tax in respect of that, not capital gains tax. It forms part of your income tax because it's a trading activity. But if it's an investment activity as opposed to a trading activity, then of course you don't pay tax on your gains for investment property. So I know that. Everyone in New Zealand knows that. The National Party pretend that that isn't the case because it's another of those instances where they close their eyes to reality because it doesn't suit the interests who put them in Parliament and keep them here. The plain truth is that the vast majority of people who buy an investment property often make deductions for their losses suffered during the period or their taxable losses during the period of ownership because their interest and rates costs exceed their rental income. They offset those losses against their other income, but then when it comes to the sale of the property, they don't pay any tax on the economic gains they make. Now, Mr McClay, having made the assertion that we had a capital gains tax, was asked, I thought, the reasonable question by the opposition, what proportion of sales of investment property attract tax in New Zealand? And he said he couldn't tell us, he'd check. I asked him, and the government members said this was a stunt. I actually thought it was at least a general question he might be able to ask. So I said, was it closer to 100% than it was to 0%? And he said he didn't know the answer to that either. And we all know it's closer to 0% than it is closer to 100%. So he went away, and we put that question down officially to him, and he was going to come back. And the answer that came back to Select Committee this week was they don't know. They don't know. So there's no substance behind his assertion earlier that people are routinely paying tax on the sale, on the profits they make on the sale of investment properties. So roll forward to today, this week at the Finance and Expenditure Committee, when we actually deliberated on the report about that sad episode. And the day after, we had a committee stage in this House on this very bill when we asked the Minister whether he'd been able to find out since Select Committee, and he didn't take a call. So we thought, well, we're voting money to the Minister of Finance in respect of the Treasury, and he was up for estimates hearing today. It was in public session, so I'm not breaching privilege or anything. And we asked him whether he'd had any advice from the Treasury as to the percentage of investment properties that are sold for an economic gain that pay tax. And he said no, he didn't have that either. So here we have the government overseeing an economy where we've got increasing inequality, we've got the lowest. Here we go. They say, here we go again. Well, actually, repetition is necessary for some of the people opposite. We've got the lowest rates of home ownership in 50 years. We've got the highest rates of child poverty, certainly in my lifetime. And we've got growing gaps between wealthy suburbs and less wealthy suburbs in Auckland, as proven by the latest census data, which is the best data that we have, which showed a very large increase in the gap in the relative well-being of peoples in Auckland. And then we've had the chief economist of NZIER, Shamabil Jacob, in the last day saying these gaps are widening between ethnic groups, between geographic regions, and effectively between wealthy and less wealthy. Well, I suspect it's not going to come back to bite me during any term under this government, because this is classic Conservative Party politics around the world. Cut taxes for the wealthy. It's what they've done disproportionately in their earlier... rubbish again, says Mr Joyce. Mr Joyce, point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the honourable member.
Mr Joyce just called me a liar. I would ask that he be forced to withdraw and apologise.
Order. If the member has used that word, it's not acceptable in the House. It can lead to disorder. And if the member has, I'd ask him to stand, withdraw and apologise.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the honourable Stephen Joyce.
It's important to point out that I didn't call the member a liar. I did say there were some lies, and I appreciate that's still unparliamentary, and I will withdraw and apologise.
Well, that's drawing a long bow. I'd ask the member to stand and withdraw. Stand and withdraw.
Can we do it again?
I ask the member to stand and withdraw. No. Member will do it properly. The member stands, say, I stand and withdraw.
I stand and withdraw.
Thank you. Call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is true that the income tax cuts of the national government disproportionately favoured the well-off. What's that? That's correct. Thank you. That's incorrect, he says. 40% of them went to the top 10% of income earners. The offsets that the government claims in respect of removing depreciation allowances on property were not paid by the same people, and the incidence of the increase in GST in proportion to income disproportionately falls on the lower income people relative to the higher income people who pay a lower proportion of their income in GST than lower income people do, because people who save their money don't pay GST on their savings, and higher income people save more relative to their income compared with smaller people. The arithmetic of this is so clear, and the National Party denies it. We have a country where we've got decreasing rates of home ownership, increasing rates of child poverty. The government misrepresents our inequality statistics every day. They say that the Perry report that shows that annual income inequality hasn't changed much in recent years, which is correct. The only time it's gone down substantially in the last couple of decades was actually pursuant to working for families, which the National Party, including John Key, called communism by stealth at the time. Mr Speaker, other than that period, income inequality on an annual basis hasn't changed much in recent years, although it's changed a lot in the last 2 decades, from being in the best 30% of the world to the worst 40% of the world. The unfortunate reality for New Zealand is once you get to being in the worst 40% of the world, and when you realise that those figures do not include capital gains, which are more concentrated in New Zealand than other countries that tax capital gains because we encourage them by way of our tax system, you realise that inequality in New Zealand is of course getting worse every year, because the consequences stack up year after year after year. They do stack up year after year after year, and you see it in home ownership rates that decline year after year after year, and child poverty rates that increase year after year after year. But, Mr Speaker, despite that, we have the Minister of Revenue saying that this bill meets its purpose of making sure that everyone pays their fair share, which is just patently not true. In fact, the greatest tax burden in New Zealand falls on the middle classes. The middle classes don't have that concentration of tax avoidance through non-taxable economic income in the form of capital gains. They do bear most of the burden of paying tax in New Zealand, and of course they pay a higher proportion of their income in GST than wealthier New Zealanders. So in effect, middle-class New Zealanders pay higher rates of tax than the most wealthy people in New Zealand, and that's patently unfair. And indeed, you just need to see the massive increases in wealth of the rich listers and the small amount of tax that's paid by them as a proportion of their income, and then you look at some of the other high asset owning classes of taxpayer like farmers, and you see they don't pay their fair share either.
I call the honourable member Paul Goldsmith.
The man who pulls it.
Thank you very much.